Well, thank you, Rachel, for counting us in there. And hello, Sarah and Will. As we do each week, we're just going to wait for a couple of minutes while all of the registered participants or attendees join in with us today. I can see down the bottom of the screen there that people have remembered. They've obviously set reminders because this is an unusually early webinar for us. Normally we do them later in the afternoon. But because Will and Sarah are, or Sarah and Will, I should say, over in Vancouver, we had to do this so that we could be kind to them and not be making them stay up too late. So we're having an interesting chat today. It's one that I'm quite excited to hear about. It's the idea of Windvane self-steering, and obviously with the Yacht Sales Co and Multihull Solutions, for those who have a monohull, this is probably a natural fit or a logical fit, but it's going to be interesting today to hear how the Windvanes perform and operate on the multi-hulls. So we're looking forward to it. If we could just jump over to the next slide there. We're just waiting. It's always a bit hard to get the screen to jump forward. There we go. So while we're waiting for everyone to click through, our next webinar will be the Destination Tahiti with Mariner Boating. That's on Thursday, the 22nd of July, so in 1 month's time. And that is going to be an exciting webinar. We're going to be having the assistance of our friend Stephanie Betts, who lives over in Tahiti and has been cruising over there for many years with Trevor. And so a lot of people with a lot of experience in being able to talk about sailing in Tahiti and French Polynesia. Also, we've now had 25 webinars since we first started doing this series back at the start of COVID last year. And you can find all of our recordings of all our previous webinars there on YouTube, on the Multihull Solutions or the Yacht Sales Co YouTube channels. And they're there, and there's some very interesting content now that's useful to go and find that might be relevant to whatever you're looking for. And if we click over to the next screen, just as we always do, we welcome as many questions as you would like to type. To do that, you click your Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, type in your question, and then we will either answer it, we'll interrupt Will and Sarah if it's something that's relevant to the part of the presentation they're up to, or if it's a general question, we'll hold it over for a Q&A session at the end. But we will endeavour to answer all your questions. So if you'd like to click to the next slide. Okay, so I'm Greg Boller. We host these webinars and have done since we started them, and in the background managing the presentation today is Rachel. Nice and bright and red, the writing today. So that's who we are. And then if we jump over to the next slide. And there we are. So we're at the start of the presentation. So we'd like to introduce, we've got Sarah and Will Curry sitting there in Vancouver in their office. So welcome and thank you for making the time and for staying up a bit late so that we can do this presentation today. What time is it there, by the way?
It's 6 o'clock. So
oh, it's not too bad.
Okay. No.
Okay. All right. So what I'll do, as I always do, is I'm going to stop my video there so that you can be front and center. And we'll let you both get on with your presentation for the day.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for that introduction, Greg. Really appreciate it. And Rachel for managing things in the background. Now, I'm Sarah, and this is Will, and we're really excited to talk to you guys today about Windvane self-steering. So thank you for who's here and able to make it live, and thank you for watching later if you're doing that. Just quickly what we're going to go through today so you know what's coming up. We'll talk a little bit about us and Hydrovane. We'll go through a Windvane 101. So maybe for some people who aren't really familiar with what it even is, the types, and we'll go back to our lovely Hydrovane model here and do a little demonstration of how to set everything up. We'll talk about autopilots, emergency steering, and then we'll go through various installations and how you would configure it with a focus on multi-hulls for sure. And then we'll get to the Q&A if there's any at the end. So some family history. We're cruisers too. We're sailors. Will grew up in a family of sailors. He and his family were cruising when he was in his teens down in Mexico. And then Will and I have actually been cruising together and sailing together for about 10 years, which is crazy. And our boat is currently in Mexico, and we've added these two little twin boys to our crew. So we're sailing not as easy as it used to be, but
not so
we're having fun. And the history of Hydrovane. So that is actually our family business. The product Hydrovane was commercialized back in 1968. So it does predate us a little bit. And it was a British engineer who came up with the concept, and he wanted to come up with a type of Windvane that was actually different from the other style that was and is still available, which is the servo pendulum style. In 2002, which is when our family got involved, so the Curry family purchased Hydrovane, and we manufacture in England, but our office is here in Vancouver, so that's where we're actually talking to you from today. We've done lots of development, so a lot of people have this misconception that a Windvane won't work on a multi-hull or won't work on big boats. We've done a lot of development in the past 10 years to allow Hydrovane to steer bigger, heavier, faster boats, and we will talk a little bit about that. And this is just, I like to throw in some beauty shots here. So this is actually Will and I when we sailed across the Pacific in 2013. And we were just casually cruising through Fiji at this point. And just a shout out to Australia, because we made landfall in Coffs Harbour and we ended up selling our boat, a Beneteau First 405 down in Sydney. And we just had the warmest welcome from Australians. Yeah. We really felt at home there. So thank you.
Everywhere we went, people were inviting us over for backyard barbecues. And
oh, it was just awesome.
Yeah, it was pretty cool.
We can't wait to get back. And we do know we'll be crossing the Pacific next time in a catamaran. So on to Windvanes. The 101, the basics. What is it? So this is a mechanical device that steers the boat. That's the primary use. It's mechanical, so it requires no electrical power, which is unlike your autopilot to steer the boat. The other main feature is that it steers a wind-based course. So you set it on a certain point of sail, and it will keep you on that point of sail until you make an adjustment. It's not like an autopilot where you may be plugging in a compass course and it's going to keep you on that even if the wind shifts. And of course, it's mounted on the transom. And if you have two hulls, two transoms, you just pick one.
Yeah, so it was interesting when we were coming across the Pacific, we would always sort of do informal surveys at various anchorages where all the boats were kind of accumulating. And this is in Naiafu in Tonga, which is a fairly main crossroads. And you can see there's an example of 3 different vanes. So we've got our Hydrovane on the left there, which was on our Beneteau. On an older Nicholson 32, I believe, that you can see an Aries Windvane there, which is a servo pendulum style. And then also next to that, there's a smaller servo unit for a 27-foot Allegro, and both those boats sailed all the way from Sweden. The interesting thing, we went around all the boats, there was 26 boats in the anchorage at the time. 19 out of those 26 boats had Windvanes. Yeah, active cruising boats had Windvanes. So 19 out of 26 had Windvanes, because a lot of people will walk around their docks and local marinas and say, well, I don't see many Windvanes. People still use them. And the reality is they do, but most of the time, we're selling to customers who are sailing over the horizon. So they're not staying put. And of course, if you have a boat for local cruising, a Windvane is not meant to be.
So if you go back to the previous slide, the one of the yacht sailing. So on that there, obviously you're on a, you're sort of on a close reach there. If you wanted to bear away or head up further, that's a matter of just adjusting adjusting the line, and you can just change the sailing angle. Yeah.
Yeah, so you don't actually go back to the unit itself, because once it's engaged, you leave it engaged, and what you would have is a line that runs either down the lifeline, so it's not in the way of anything, you're not going to trip over it, and you would just be able to reach it from the cockpit and tug the line as you need to either bring the vane around so that you're further off the wind, or head up and bring the leading edge of the vane into the wind more.
And that's a really good question. And we'll make sure to show you when we come back just how easy it is to kind of rotate the vane to figure out what, yeah.
Yeah. All right, very good.
Thanks.
Yeah, so this is another good one. Second only to keeping the boat afloat is keeping her point in the right direction. And I think that it's interesting to note this, because we see a lot of people at various boat shows that we go to around the world that get so caught up in the next fancy gadget that you're going to add to your boat that's going to do everything. And of course it's electronic, and these things are great. We love them, don't get us wrong, but when they fail, it's a different story. So I think it's important to strip all that stuff away and remember that these are the two most fundamental points of preparing any boat for offshore sailing. So first type, so we got servo pendulums. This would be sort of a more, there's more manufacturers of this type of wind vane, and essentially what they do is they operate a vane which goes down through to a servo oar in the water, and that servo oar is actually linked through lines that run back to the wheel or the tiller of the boat and steers the boat's main rudder. So it's actually tied into your main steering. So this is a servo pendulum unit. There's some of the manufacturers you might have heard of. There's the Aries, which are now built in Holland. Windpilot, which is a German manufacturer. Monitor, which is in California. Cape Horn, which is a different type of servo unit. And then Fleming, which is in Australia. And I'm not sure they're still manufacturing, but I'd be interested to know.
Okay, maybe someone that's listening in today would know that, so we'll see if anyone can type in.
Yeah, and actually Sarah brought up a good point. Yeah, using these on a multi-hull, so they can work. They'll have their certain limitations. One of them being dealing with superstructure and getting the vane up high enough. I know, for example, the Cape Horn, they have the ability to get the vane higher with, a longer shaft assembly. But the main thing with any servo unit is they really rely on boat speed, because that's where they generate their power, because they're using the servo in the water to actually generate power to drive the wheel. And critical for any servo unit is trying to eliminate friction. So, the longer the run to the wheel, the more blocks that it goes through, the harder it is on performance for the vane. So you want to try and streamline that as much as possible.
I think another interesting point is that a servo system really has to be mounted centerline on the boat. So if you're looking at a monohull, it needs to be centerline, because you don't want that servo oar ever to kick out of the water if you're on attack. And that means that on multi-hulls, they can be mounted in the center.
Yeah, they actually can go off center as well, because they don't feel, feel faster.
Yep.
And then the next type would be servo auxiliary type system. So this is still a servo principle, but it's actually driving its own rudder. So you can see you've got a vane there that drives a servo, which is then linked to its own independent rudder. So your main rudder's fixed. These are few and far between nowadays. I think they worked well in their time, but they had too many breakage failures. Fleming used to make one. They abandoned that a while back. And then Windpilot also did it. And as far as we know, they no longer manufacture it because it's expensive to produce and there's too many appendages in the water.
Yeah, a little bit complicated. And you're not actually able to lift or move that rudder out of the water at all. So it's permanently, so it kind of extends your overall length as well.
Next type, auxiliary rudder trim tab system. So this is an auxiliary rudder, meaning it has its own independent rudder, and it has a vane that is actually directly linked to a trim tab on the back of the rudder. And as it moves the trim tab moves the rudder. So you lock off your helm, get the vane into the wind, and the vane actually drives the trim tab, which drives its own rudder. The negative on these, again, is that it is a fixed rudder, so you can't take it off. So you have that permanent structure on the boat, which isn't overly conducive to most modern boats with swim style transoms. And then the last one, auxiliary rudder, which is what the Hydrovane is, which is essentially its own vane directly linked to its own rudder that gets geared up or down through its own ratio controls. And it actually drives a semi-balanced rudder, so it takes very little power to turn, and yeah, completely independent from your main steering. And so the vane actually pivots back and forth on a horizontal axis, and that's how it generates the power, which is why the vane itself is so large.
Yeah, the difference with the Hydrovane and the vane being so large is that we're actually getting all of our power from the wind. So we need a much larger vane than some of the other systems do. Now, to fully demonstrate these things, I'm going to actually unhook here, stop sharing, and make us larger than life. And we're going to come back and we're just going to show you on the Hydrovane itself how you kind of set things up and how it works. Okay. So I always do my best here to make sure the computer doesn't shake too much as I hold it with my arms. Here we go.
So here's the remote course setting line. So this is what Greg was asking earlier. And basically, if you zoom in on the worm gears there, you can show this is just a worm gear. And then this line actually drives through the worm gear to make your course adjustments. So you'd run this somewhere near the helm, runs forward on the boat. We've got a bungee you just clip it onto, and this gets the vane into the wind.
So let's say we're sailing on a broad reach.
Okay, so broad reach, we're right about here. The boat's tracking this way, right? So we're on the helm, we're getting the boat balanced out. Sail trim and boat balance is imperative for any Windvane, and it is for autopilots too. It's just that with autopilots we get lazy and we get, you know, less focused on making sure the boat is balanced properly. But you want to make sure that the boat's not overpowered, reef early, don't be pushing the limits all the time, and the vane will do what it's supposed to do. So we're on the wheel, we've trimmed out the sails, we've locked off the wheel. So you actually, with the Hydrovane, because it's that auxiliary rudder concept, you're actually locking the rudder, not necessarily center line, it's usually off a few degrees to compensate for any helm that the boat has. So if you've got a bit of weather helm, you offset it. If you're having to lock the main rudder way off to one side, then you know that you've got a sail trim issue or a boat balance issue. So it's kind of your indicator to tell you how well the boat is set up and balanced. Wheels locked off. We've trimmed the vane into the wind. So the leading edge here, Sarah, if we just show the vane, the leading edge is into the wind. Same with the counterweights. And the rudder is just free trailing at this point. So it's actually disengaged. And what we do is we engage the unit here.
Maybe you can do that once more.
Engage. So it's disengaged. So the tiller and rudder are free trailing, and engage it, and away you go. We've got different settings here, which I'll talk about in a second, but now the vane's engaged. And so what happens is, as the boat falls off course, the apparent wind changes, which knocks the vane over, which moves the rudder and pivots back and forth. The rudder you see there is not the rudder that goes on the boat. That is a cutoff. We
get that question a lot at boat shows. How can that tiny rudder steer my boat? Perhaps a good time to show the actual rudder.
So here's the rudder.
That's composite, is it?
It's a nylon, solid nylon.
Okay. Yep.
Yeah, and so you can see it's semi-balanced, so it's got a fair bit of surface area forward of the pivot, so it takes very little power to turn.
How do you take the rudder on and off?
Yeah, so when we're coming into port and we don't want the rudder on, we disengage the unit, so the rudder is just free trailing. We lock it, we pin it up here, so it's fixed fore and aft, so it's pinned here. So that's what you would do if you're motoring and you're not using the system. Keep it fixed. And then you come down here, you either get on your swim step, or if you've got a traditional transom, you got to get a boat hook on here. That's why we weld the rein onto the end of the pin, and the rudder sinks. It's got negative buoyancy. It'll drop off like a rock. So you always want to keep a tether on it. And that's it. Rudder drops off, you ship it on board, and then vice versa. Normally, when you're at sea, you leave the rudder on. You don't touch that. It's only when you're coming into a marina or you know that you're going to be maneuvering in tight quarters that you would take that off. But most of the time, you just leave the rudder on.
Now, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, just back to the earlier point you made about locking off the main rudder.
Yeah.
Does that work with just a spin wheel lock, or do you tie it off? Or?
Yeah, that's a good question. Most wheel brakes that come with, you know, production boats nowadays are not adequate for heavy conditions. It'll work for sort of your moderate sailing conditions, but as soon as it gets heavy, you do need a way to have the wheel locked off. So what most people do is they just put a little jam cleat on either side of the wheel and then crisscross the line so that the wheel can be fixed. You need to have the ability to adjust it a bit. So you don't want it fixed in one spot. You want to be able to tweak it and then lock it off as you need to.
Very good. And just while we're there too, we've just got one, it's not a question, it's a hello. Hi, Sarah and Will, good to see you. Hope the little ones are doing fine. Waiting to hear if Fred has been all repaired and is in good nick now. Hugs, Jean.
Jean!
Oh, yeah. Awesome.
So Jean Socrates is actually, has been around the world a few times, and I wish we had your Hydrovane. It was literally sitting right here. It's all ready to go.
Yeah.
We moved it out of the way for this presentation, but the answer is yes.
Oh, so Fred is the Windvane.
Fred is the Hydrovane.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, you'll find that with the vanes take on a personality of themselves, so everybody finds a name for them. So yeah, it's interesting.
I'm sure Wilson is a commonly used one.
Yes, you're right. Actually,
Wilson,
we've just heard that.
Prince Harry, we've had a lot of that.
Harry.
Heidi.
Rightio. Sorry to interrupt. I'll let you keep going.
Wonderful. What about the vane? Do you leave it on, or what do you do if you're not using it?
So normally, if you're just boats at anchor, some people leave it on, but this vane cover is made of ripstop nylon, so it'll deteriorate quite quickly in the sun. So usually you want to get it off. There's a quick release knob here. This gets the vane off. Got height restrictions here, and then you just get it on the back of a cabin door or somewhere out of the sun that's not going to break down in the UV.
Gee, it's light, isn't it?
Yeah, it's I think it's about 2 pounds.
2 kilos.
2
Oh,
kilos.
including the box. Never mind. What about emergency steering, Will? Because that's something we also get asked about a lot. How would you use this? You know, if something happened to your main rudders or your main any part of your steering system, how can you use this in that emergency?
Yeah, so that's kind of a neat feature. So what you do is you disengage the unit, and we basically put the ratio knob in the far right setting here. So it's disengaged. And now you put an extension on the tiller. This is one that we supply as an optional item, but some people will just put their own on that's longer or shorter. And you can essentially just use this and drive your boat like a giant dinghy using the tiller and the rudder. So
that's a great benefit just in itself, isn't it, as an emergency steering?
Yeah, well, and it's interesting because a lot of the offshore races and even some rallies, they require that you have an emergency steering capability. So you're really killing 2 birds with 1 stone by having the emergency rudder, and then of course you're using it as a vane. We actually get a lot of bigger boat owners, or that are viewing the Hydrovane as a backup to their autopilot, and once they start sailing with it, they realize that the Hydrovane is their primary steering source, and the autopilot takes a back seat. So it's nice because you don't have to carry as many spares on board because you're not relying on one system.
Maybe just really quickly before we go back down, we can just talk a little bit about the different ratio settings that are for different conditions that you're sailing in.
Yeah, so back to this is your engaging and disengaging. So you can see here we've got 4 different settings in total. So all right is disengaged. all the way to the left is actually your maximum amount of power. So you've got maximum leverage here and least amount of rudder deflection. So this would be your sort of light to moderate sailing conditions. As the conditions pick up, they build, we can go to the 2-to-1, which is the middle setting, or even down to the 1-to-1 setting, which gives you less leverage here, but actually means more rudder deflection. So we can go up to 35 degrees rudder deflection.
And you can just show us again, going through those different settings on how they actually affect the rudder as well.
Yeah, so here's the light air, 15-degree rudder. So that's your light to moderate conditions. And then here's your heavy weather, 35-degree rudder
More
deflection.
steerage.
So you got more steerage and less power here because we've got more apparent wind to generate the power. So it's a fine-tuning thing. I do get a lot of people who, sailed many, many miles and say, by the way, what do the different settings do? These are fine-tuning adjustments, but they do make a difference. Another thing I want to show you too is we do actually have, this is a new vane, newish vane, and it's called the extendable vane. And this is very relevant for high-speed boats and multi-hulls that are going higher speeds. And basically the way it works is it's like a trombone, and the whole vane itself actually moves up and down to increase sensitivity. So in light airs we go down, or sorry, in light airs we go up to increase the leverage. So we've got more leverage, and then we bring it down in heavy conditions. And you can also incline it all the way down to 15 degrees above horizontal, or all the way vertical for maximum sensitivity. So it's a nice tool for being able to just increase the power and the sensitivity of the vane.
Excellent. Okay, will bring us back over here.
One other thing.
One other thing.
I also want to show you, this is actually a mounting kit that we have as an option that mounts onto the Hydrovane shaft assembly. And this is for the Watt & C hydrogenerator. So this is a product that we distribute, and you can see it actually behind Sarah here, but it attaches onto the Hydrovane. So you actually have a mounting point for mounting the Watt & C rather than having to drill more holes into the boat.
I'm not already familiar with the Watt & C.
Yeah, so this actually attaches on here. It's awkward.
That was extremely awkward and not practiced, so apologies. Okay, so I'm just going to go back to sharing my screen here.
It's going really well, and that was very, very informative.
Oh, good. And I just wanted to give another quick shout out to Jean Socrates. And if you haven't heard of her before, she's been around the world a few times, and she's actually the oldest woman to have sailed around the world solo, nonstop, unassisted via the Great Capes. So an amazing, amazing feat.
Kudos to her.
Kudos, big kudos. Okay.
Just while we're there, I'll just interrupt with a question from Vicky from Island Cruising.
Yes.
She said, how about boats with full fold down transoms? Is there a way that the unit can be removed from the transom, or do you just remove the vane and rudder?
Yeah, that's a great question. And depending on the type of boat, and we do talk about drop down transom installations a little bit later, we go off to the side. So you still have full functionality of that drop down.
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of the bigger modern boats that have these drop down transoms, those boats are really not designed to be heeling way over on their ears. So some people will look at it and say, oh, it's 4 feet off center, it's not going to work. And the reality is it does, because if you're heeling more than 10 or 15 degrees on those boats, you're not going any faster, you're just plowing more water, and it's not an efficient way to sail. So we've found that the big offsets is really not an issue for us. If you were ever concerned about it, the whole unit can actually be sunk down lower in the water, so the rudder has better immersion. But we can get into those specifics depending on the boat.
We'll definitely show some photos because that's very common. So we do have a quick video here because we're not able to properly demonstrate here. We'll show you on our boat of how you actually put the Hydrovane rudder on.
Okay, so what we do here on installing the rudder, doing a good little tip, we actually drove a hole right through the handle. And what that does is it creates a center of gravity for the rudder, whatever you want to call it, pivot point, so that when I'm holding it in the water, the folds up and down, so it's not trying to stay cockeyed, and that makes a big difference to getting the rudder on and off. So I've got it tied off here at all times, very important. Lower the rudder on, get it onto the bottom of the shaft. Wiggle it up. Drain hole on the side will spit the water out. And I've got the rudder pinned up here, so the rudder should be the fore and aft. Insert it in the hole. It should be a tight friction fit. And then get the little R-pin lanyard. So when I want to take it off, I just pull the lanyard, pull the pin, the rudder drops off. Because the rudder has negative buoyancy, it's very easy to get off. It's trickier to put on, so you're going to put it on in the marina or at anchor in your dinghy before you leave port. So yeah, simple as that.
Hopefully you could hear that okay, but yeah, it is really simple to put on, especially if you have a scoop or a swim step. Yeah, taking it off is very easy, but you want to do that, or you don't want to do that, of course, while you're at sea. No need.
The sound was fine.
Oh, good. Great. The next video here is just a Windvane in action. So these are some guys who crossed the Atlantic a few years ago. I think they were probably part of the ARC rally. And we'll just see what it looks like out there in heavy conditions and how the vane moves back and forth.
It's a Hydrovane 43.
We're in the process of changing the guard here. Dennis is coming out from behind the wheel. This morning. What do you got to say for 2 weeks on the boat, Captain?
Great. This is kind of a great beginning.
We want to get a picture of some of these waves coming up on the side over there. You got the Hydrovane, which seems to be doing its job. Oh, look here. Look out. Feel those come up over the boat. Okay, say goodbye. Goodbye, Dennis. Goodbye.
So a decent little ocean swell, and interesting to note in that video, the main wheel being fixed. So that provides what I think is a more usable cockpit for sure. We still have a job when we sail with the Windvane. As Will alluded to before, sail trim is so very important. So if the Windvane's not working, and even if your autopilot is just grinding away, normally the answer is in the sails. Looking at, are the sails proportionate? Do you need to reef? With a Windvane, we find, especially for a monohull, using a pole to keep the sails full is really, really important. To
keep the sails proportioned, and also for downwind sailing, deck sweeping sails are horrible. You know, you can't pull them out very well. They don't have very good shape. They're great for sailing around the buoys, but for offshore sailing, it really doesn't make a lot of sense. So if you go with a high cut clew, the boat is actually going to be less weather helm, and you're going to get better visibility under the headsail. And this is primarily for monohulls, but I would think for multi-hulls it would apply as well.
And watch your heading.
And yeah, always watch your heading, because the wind shifts. You know, the vane's always following the wind. The wind's always shifting a little bit. But it's surprising, you know, a lot of people say, well, I'm constantly going to be tending to the vane. When in reality, that's actually not the case at all. You know, when we headed out on our long crossing to the Marquesas from Mexico, we did not touch the wheel for the first 10 days. And we basically just, you know, tweaked the vane as we needed to, but we would go 24 hours without touching anything. And, you know, you're adjusting periodically if the boat is getting overpowered, you know, you reef down a little bit as you need to, but you're not tweaking it all the time.
And then adjusting for conditions. So some vanes or some wind vane systems have different vanes that you put on depending on the conditions. For the Hydrovane, you're actually depowering it. You're gearing it down like we showed you, and you're even raking the vane so that it's not going to oversteer the boat. Because everyone thinks, you know, oh, what happens in heavy conditions? Heavy conditions are actually easier for a wind vane because there's more apparent wind. So when there's too much apparent wind, you want to be able to reduce how it's acting on the rudder.
The general rule of thumb is the windier it gets, the better they perform. So.
We like this slide. So
Mhm.
this is kind of your part of the world. This was a passage between Fiji and Vanuatu. And you'll notice on that second day, we kind of veered back towards our destination.
Yeah, so this is actually a good example of how following the wind can actually be quite beneficial. We had left Fiji and the winds were actually come around fairly southerly, and we were sort of close haul to close reach, and it was kind of uncomfortable. And we were headed for Port Resolution in Tana.
Which is not our Port Resolution,
Or
Vanuatu.
in Vanuatu. And we kind of look at each other and say, you know, maybe we should just fall off a bit and make this more comfortable and enjoy the passage, and we'll just see where we end up. And so we did. We fell off a bit. The boat was more comfortable. Our boat speed was good.
I think we were heading to Port Vila at that point, which is not where we wanted to go.
But we were rolling with it. And then literally 24 hours went by. We didn't touch anything. We didn't touch the settings on the vane, the sails, and that was our course. So we ended up, the wind came around, the vane followed it, and we basically went straight into Port Vila. I'm pretty sure we might have sailed, you know, a few more miles, but we were way more comfortable, and the boat was sailing, you know, really efficiently.
Really efficiently.
Just a good example.
And obviously the whole background of this is a perfect piece of equipment for long ocean passages where you've got the chance of that occurring. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it can be a different story for coastal sailing, but even for coastal sailing, you'll find situations where it's, you know, the priority is really the crew and keeping the boat comfortable rather than trying to really beat yourself to death. And usually when you do that, you know, the steering is nicer, everything's just nicer on board. So that's why we do that in there.
And listen, just while we're there, we've got a question from Chris. If the vane is mounted behind but slightly offset 1 meter to a wind generator, does that impact on performance?
Normally the vane is below the wind generator. So normally the wind generators are quite high. We don't really struggle with dirty airflow from things like that. The main thing is that the vane, when it pivots over on its side, because it has a fairly large sweep, is not going to hit the pole that the wind generator sits on. So as long as it has clearance, it's not a problem. Dirty airflow is less of an issue than most people think. They think, oh, I've got a Dodger and a Bimini and dinghy on davits, and this isn't going to work. When in reality, it actually is not a problem, because when you're sailing, the apparent wind is always going to be at least 30 degrees off the bow. And if you're on a multi-hull, maybe more. And, you know, for downwind sailing, the apparent wind hits the vane first. So it's generally not an issue.
And that's part of an planning and installation as well, where we would look at photos and make sure that that someone would get the right shaft length, the right vane, because we do have one shorter and wider vane that is supplied if there might be an aerial obstruction, just like that.
Yeah, every unit is spec for the boat, and that would be the same for every manufacturer. They would spec it for based on the boat.
So just a question, I've tried to pay good attention, but you talk about the leaning over of the vane. So you have a vertical, the vane is vertical, as you say, you set it up into the wind. What is the purpose or the function of the leaning over? Is it to spill wind in gusts, or?
No, it's actually to keep you on course, right? Because it's always stable horizontal axis. So when the vane, right now you can see when the vane is standing tall, you're on course. When the vane is flopped over on its side, it's moved the rudder to try and bring you back on course. So it's constantly waving from side to side to keep the boat tracking in the right direction.
Gotcha. And it's always trying to return itself to vertical center.
Yeah. Exactly. When it's vertical, you're on course according to the vane.
Thank you.
And I keep switching over to this slide, but I don't want to stay on it for too long, even though it is the truth. We love our Autopilot. We love our Autopilot as well. We have like a hydraulic below deck Autopilot, but we really do feel that both of them have their place. And we use our Autopilot, you know, if we're motoring, and sometimes, well,
if we're in squally conditions, and things are gusty, we'll engage the Autopilot. In some scenarios, we'll have it engaged in tandem with the Hydrovane while we get things under control.
But, you know, if we're going on a passage more than, you know, 5 nautical miles, we're using the Hydrovane. The realities of offshore sailing, of course, are different when you're doing longer distances. If you are planning to completely rely on an Autopilot, the amperage draw is huge, especially as conditions worsen. So the other factor is the dependence on the other systems. This is actually Will taking a dive deep back into our aft lazarette before we headed across the Pacific, and just checking out all of our steering system. And to be honest, we were just so thankful that we weren't completely relying on one steering system. An autopilot for me especially is a bit of a black box. You know, if something failed there, I certainly would not really know how to fix it.
Well, I think also more importantly, you know, it's diagnosing and fixing things at sea is very difficult. It doesn't matter what type of boat you're on, it's not comfortable. Especially most people feel a little bit off, you know, they're going to be dealing with some level of seasickness. So it's important to just sort of picture what it would be like to deal with situations like that.
Yeah, and we like to talk about reliability as well, because we thought we had quite a reliable autopilot on our first boat, the Beneteau. And again, we were in Fiji, we were enjoying ourselves, and we were getting ready for that next passage to Vanuatu. And I remember we were in Vunda Point Marina, and we had all waited this huge system that had blown through, and we'd been waiting for about a week. Finally, a weather window came to do the next hop, and we checked out of the country. We were heading out to the pass. And all of a sudden we were motoring, and all of a sudden the boat just went zoom, like completely a 90-degree shift. And we got back on course, and it happened again and again. And we thought, oh my goodness, not really sure what to do here. But we felt so lucky that we knew as soon as we were beyond the reef, we were going to be using our Hydrovane to steer. So we actually were completely, you know, not dependent at all on our autopilot. And the fact that it was broken meant that we didn't actually have to go back to port and wait for any parts or find someone to fix it. We could just keep going. So this is
the ironic thing is we didn't fix it until we got to Australia.
Yeah, this is, oh gosh. So this was back in 2013. I love looking at how there were no good Grib viewers back then. So this is kind of the Grib files that we were looking at.
Wind didn't exist.
Yeah. And what we did though is we had a tiller pilot. So that's another really neat thing that you can do with a lot of wind vanes is you can actually set up a tiller pilot. It's very easy on the Hydrovane because you can just directly drive the Hydrovane rudder, but that became our electric autopilot for motoring. So we had that kind of redundancy and backup as well.
And that's a great solution if you want to have an inexpensive backup. Those Raymarine 1000s, they're about $350. Any of them will work, and the specs that they're rated for in terms of displacement and boat type, it doesn't matter because it's actually driving the Hydrovane rudder, not the boat's main rudder.
Interesting.
And this is your part of the world, so I don't know if it's as exciting for you guys as it is for all of our North American friends, but the reason we were heading to the island of Tanna was to visit this, and we'll see if everyone's still awake here.
Hard to get appreciate the contour here. Hard to see through the snow. That's what we're talking about. Look at that. Holy, look at the lava down there. That is insane.
I love talking about the social aspect as well. So if all of our buddy boats had headed off to come to this island and hang out on the top of a volcano before us, and we'd showed up like all by ourselves because our autopilot broke and we'd had to wait for another weather window, I would have been very disappointed because I was quite terrified.
It sounds silly, but it's true. Yeah, so back to autopilots, you know, it's interesting when you look at the complexity of an autopilot system because it's not just the autopilot itself, it's everything that you use to support it. So it's your charging systems to support it, it's your battery bank to store it, it's all the connections in between, and it's fairly complex. So when you look at what a wind vane does in terms of giving you that independence and not being reliant on any other system on the boat, it's pretty valuable.
And quiet too.
And quiet,
yeah, completely in sync. Emergency steering is something else that we definitely want to touch on. Hope for the best, prepare for the worst. I guess that goes for any passage.
Yeah, we are hearing more and more of rudder and steering failures all the time. And I think it's just because there's more boats crossing oceans, there's more boats out there, but also because modern boats are generally nowadays spade hun rudder boats. So the rudders are more vulnerable to hitting something. Even new modern Hallberg-Rassies, they're made with, you know, spade hun rudders. On multi-hulls, you're even more vulnerable because you've got less protection in front of them, you know, depending on the design of the cat or the trimaran, and you've got two hulls. So these are just some examples. That's actually our rudder on our boat compared to the Hydrovane rudder. That's on a Jeanneau 43. The photo on the left is the Motiva 49. It was a Swedish built, very high-end custom built boat. And he was in sailing to the Canaries.
He was left from the Canaries. He was heading across the Atlantic.
And he was, I think, 3 or 4 days out, and in the middle of the night, he heard this bang and came back to grab the wheel, and there was nothing. And the rudder post had just sheared clean off right at the hull. So there was no water coming in, but he had no steerage. And fortunately, he had the Hydrovane, and he went back to it, and it steered him, you know, 4 or 5 days down to.
He got to the Cape Verde Islands.
Yeah,
he was very thankful. And, you know, because we are in this business of steering, we hear these stories quite often you know, normally they have good endings, I suppose, is a good thing if they're a customer.
But they're not. The interesting thing is a lot of them aren't rudder failures. They're actually linkage failures. They're quadrant failures. You know, there's a lot of things in that system that can go wrong. And generally,
like this was a quadrant failure.
This was a quadrant failure. Yeah. I mean, generally your steering systems are in the worst part of the boat for accessibility. So they kind of get neglected. So it's just.
So on that point, Chris has asked a good question, because you're talking about moving parts and potential for failure. What about on the actual, on the vane itself? What consumable parts are involved, i.e. items that require replacement after a period, example, seals or bearings? As in, is there much, do you get much failure or breakage of the vane itself?
We sell an offshore spares kit, so that's something that we supply to most people. It includes a vane cover, which is the ripstop nylon cover, and that does degrade in the sun. It includes a couple of the locking pins, so those are for locking the shaft and locking the rudder on, and those are just subject to metals fatigue. It includes a little plastic part that we call the drive sleeve. You know, it's a very inexpensive part, but it does get some wear. And
you're probably 10 or 15,000 miles before you'd replace that. And then there's also the bottom bearing on the shaft.
We don't even supply that anymore.
And it's not that common, but you do get some wear on it over time. But generally speaking, it's pretty minimal.
We see units that have, you know, were built 30 years ago and they're still in good condition. We see units that have gone around the world multiple times and they're still looking pretty good. So yeah, they're made for a lot of rigorous steering and abuse from the ocean.
No, very good answers.
Moving on to installations, because I think people often get their questions answered here. And I love this photo. This is a friend of ours, Olivia, and she sailed she sailed to Hawaii solo, and now she's in French Polynesia and heading to Fiji. She might head your way one day, but a really, really neat girl.
That's a great shot.
Yeah, isn't it? It's so beautiful. Sounds great, but it won't fit with my boat's davits, arch, gantry, radar mast, transom, etc. We do hear this a lot. Luckily, Hydrovane is, we can configure a lot of different things to make it work for a specific boat and for a specific transom.
There's almost no boat that we can't supply to. It's more just a matter of configuring the right configuration so that everything fits. And every boat nowadays, every cruising boat has some sort of gear on the back that we need to accommodate. So we're pretty used to it.
In terms of components, the drive unit, we talk about a drive unit. That's kind of the main section of the Hydrovane. We have 3 brackets. Almost all installations will only use 2 of them, and it just depends on the nature of the transom. We have a shaft assembly. That's what you're seeing here. And those go up in 10-inch, 25-centimeter increments. And the length that you need is dependent on the freeboard of the boat and any other gear you may have. The rudder is the same for all boats. And then the vane assembly, the standard vane is quite tall. We have a stubby vane to fit under gantries. And then we also have the extendable vane that we showed you before. So there's lots of ways to configure. Many modern boats have swim step, sugar scoop, and the nice thing is that we install off center. So if you like using your platform, as we do on our boat, a great way to install it is just to go off to the side.
And this is primarily for auxiliary rudder systems that can go off center. Servo units are not really meant to be offset. There might be a few systems that can do very small offsets, but again, as we mentioned earlier, they do have that risk that if the servo ever comes out of the water, then you lose all your steerage. So really only auxiliary rudder systems are meant to go off center. And in most cases, it's actually better to go off center because it gets the Hydrovane rudder into cleaner water, less affected by the wash coming off of your main rudder or keel or anything else you have below the water line. So 80% of our installs are off center.
The big drop down, so off to the side. And this boat crossed the Atlantic, and they reported back they couldn't find a point of sale it didn't work on. So
this was one of our first big offsets to accommodate a platform, and his autopilot died 5 days out of the Canaries. And he wrote us an email when he got to the other side and said, Hydrovane steered me all the way across. So
that Hydrovane was called Prince Harry. Yeah.
That's a very good image and a very good demonstration of the offset. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, most modern boats now with these big platforms, that's kind of what you get, and we're pretty used to it. And as I said earlier, heeling is not as a significant issue as some people might think. Multi-hulls, yeah. So here's a few examples of different setups that we supplied. It's interesting because you can see how for a lot of them, what we do is we actually have an extended heading tube, which puts the top of the vane. You can see in most of those photos, it actually extends the top section, but it keeps the emergency tiller and the controls at an accessible height. So we get everything up higher. The photo on the left of the older Fontaine Peugeot Belize, that's a good example of going on the inside of a transom. I would have liked to have seen that unit mounted a little bit further aft to maximize the leverage of the rudder, because the further forward you go, the less performance you get. They reported that everything was good and they love their Hydrovane, but I still would have liked to have seen it further aft. You can also see the two Watt and C brackets coming off of it. So the Watt and C actually just fits into those bracket arms, and you can use that as your mounting point. And then the Seawind 1260, this was a recent installation just done a couple weeks ago. A good example of using the longer shaft. He offset the Hydrovane inside on the platform, so you can still use the steps coming up and down the transom. And then the vane is up into clean air above the solar panels. So as you can see, there's lots of ways to configure these.
So the Lagoon 40 installation there with the gentleman in the red shirt, are you happy with that installation? Because that looks like it's the least obtrusive in terms of taking up step space with brackets.
Yeah, that's a good one. As long as the Hydrovane is not mounted on the cross beam or further forward, because the cross beam, you get dirty water issues from the hulls and you lose that leverage. But that's a good example. I like that one because he's angled the arms downwards. Those upper A bracket arms, we really don't care where you position them because you're triangulating the loads over 3 points. Yeah, it's just a matter of finding your attachment points.
And there's a couple other installations here, and here this one's mounted on the cross beam, but that's a Prout 50, so a little bit of a older design. And I had reached out to a few customers to get some really specific Catamaran feedback. And I was really pleased that the owner, Patrick, of this Nautilus 47, the boat's in Fiji, and he's actually in Port Stevens. But I asked him what conditions he used it in, and he sailed from the Caribbean all the way to where the boat is.
England.
I believe he took delivery in St. Lucia, but we can fight about that later. What conditions did you use the Hydrovane in? He said, whilst cruising full time, we would use it just about all the time. 8 knots was the minimum speed that we would need for it to keep a reliable course in terms of wind speed. And I asked, did high boat speeds affect the vane's performance? Not really. A cruising cat is generally fairly heavy and shouldn't shoot off at high speeds in the gusts like racing versions do. In 3 years and 20,000 miles, they never found a limit or a condition where it didn't work. And I was asking about the best sail plan for downwind conditions, and just normal rig, main jib or main and code 0. Yeah, so that was really great feedback to hear. And this is a good installation with the rudder
aft,
really far aft. And then on the other side, the Prout 50, so this boat's currently in Hawaii, and they bought it when they were in Panama, and they crossed from Panama to the Galapagos and Hawaii using the Hydrovane for many, many miles. They found it worked best with the heaviest of winds, 20 knots plus, requiring very little adjustment. Sail plan is very important, and they consider it a good tool to teach you how to balance your individual boat. Downwind sails also worked great, would not require any adjustments for up to 8 hours at a time. And then interesting for coastal sailing, a good point that, that Tim made was, we found even in confused seas close to land, the Hydrovane combined with our Autopilot on a vane setting worked really well together and reduced our power consumption over time significantly. So that's something that, you know, you can actually do with an auxiliary rudder. If you are in really, really confused conditions, you can actually engage your Autopilot as well on kind of a low gain setting, and have your vane doing most of the work. But then if for some reason you kind of get thrown off, the Autopilot kicks in to bring you back. So we have heard of people doing that in those types of conditions. And yeah, on this boat, actually, the hydraulic steering began to leak after departing Panama. The Autopilot motor eventually failed. The Hydrovane was put to the test, performed well, and it was a blessing that it works as an independent rudder because it was not integrated into the main steering system. So Tim here rates Hydrovane as one of his most valuable pieces of kit, which was really great to hear for a big boat like that.
We didn't pay him to write these.
No,
emails.
we didn't. I was asking for multi-hull feedback, but these are the answers I got, so I'm happy.
You can actually go on the True Stories page of our website, and we've got hundreds of emails, and we try and post it all, the good and the bad, so people can see exactly what's happening. But there's lots of good feedback there. The other thing I was going to say about catamarans and you know, any boat that's a high speed boat that's doing that's the limitation for wind vanes. You know, if you've got a high speed boat that's doing, you know, 15, 20 knots and 20 knots of wind, there's not enough apparent wind for the vane, and the apparent wind is changing so quickly that it just can't keep up. So that's kind of where the misconception has come from, that you can't do multi-hulls. And as we've talked about, a lot of these multi-hulls, especially if you're going further distance, you're sailing a lot more conservatively. It's not about pushing the boat hard and doing your 10, 15 knots. It's more about keeping the boat all in peace, everyone comfortable, and the vane will steer. So
heavy boats, you know, this was an Oyster 575. We met the owner at the Southampton Boat Show a few years ago, and he had really good results. Dual Hydrovanes is something we've kind of been getting into with even larger boats, so that's interesting. And the lightest, smallest boat we've ever fitted was a 9-foot boat that left from San Francisco. So we've done the interesting stuff here.
The dual Hydrovanes is for obviously very big, heavy boats, and it's basically 2 vanes, is 2 rudders, and double the power. So that's how we get into the real heavy stuff.
Okay, folks, I'll just interrupt there. We've come up to almost an hour now, so we'll be wrapping up shortly. But I just wanted to let anyone that's watching today know, just if you've got any more questions to ask, type them now so that we can get you the answers before we close off. Sorry for the interruption.
Thank you. Yeah, so we are very, very close. So davits, no problem. Aerial obstructions, there was the question before about the wind generator. There's always a way, and you'll see there are stubby vane. And in terms of what breaks, so this was a great testimonial from Jean-Luc Vandenheede, who was the winner of the Golden Globe race that left from France in 2018. It was around the world, nonstop, unassisted, using only technology that was available 50 years ago. So wind vanes were kind of on display, and he won the race.
We wrote him an email after saying what broke.
And he said, I changed nothing. So that was quite fantastic with a lot of wear in the Southern Ocean. Cost, of course, is a question. So With all Windvanes, you do get this other crew member, you get the confidence in your boat, savings on power consumption. Often it's a once in a lifetime purchase.
Yeah.
And then if you are looking at an auxiliary rudder type system that's not tied into the main steering, the ease of operation, and of course being emergency rudder and steering system.
It's interesting looking at the cost of it, because you'd actually, if you were to say, oh, I'm going to go get a backup autopilot, or I'm going to carry spares for my main autopilot, you could spend close to that, or, you know, some sort of figure that's quite high. Whereas with the Windvane, you get the vane, and you can also throw the little tiller pilot on it to give you your backup autopilot, and you also have an emergency rudder. So from a cost perspective, it's much easier to justify that cost when you look at it from that perspective.
And I do hope that I can just squeeze one more little video in here, because it's so cute. This is what our sailing life is like now, and why we really, really need that extra crew member.
Are you so hungry? We give you fed for dinner. Come to the bar. Come to the bar. Kippy, come to the bar. We're serving at the bar tonight. I think that diaper's a bit wet. Kippy, come to the bar. Come up to the bar for your dinner. Come up to the bar for your dinner. Okay. So good. Sunset at sea. Just sitting over the Baja.
Beautiful.
Gurney steering. Seas have calmed down. Big fish got away already. But it's really serene considering our situation with the twins. Awesome.
You just want to go and be there, don't you?
Yeah, not recommended though, sailing offshore passages with twin toddlers for relaxation anyways. There's our website, our emails, and we are on Instagram a bit if you want to contact us. And I did want to give a huge thank you to Multihull Solutions, to Greg and Rachel for giving us the opportunity, and Yacht Sales Company, and then Down Under Rally for kind of connecting us at the beginning of all of this. So thanks to you guys, and thanks for everyone who's watching.
Yeah, no, fantastic and very well done. And it's one of those presentations where it's just going to be a great resource to have on our YouTube channel, because often people don't know that much about how or why or what purpose one would use the Windvane, and I think you've just done a fantastic job today of explaining that. I think there is one more question there. I'm just checking. Okay, so we've got a client, Chris, who says that he's got photos of the Hydrovane on a Fontaine-Pajot Lipari, which is the only one. So and has said if you want them. So I think the answer is yes, Chris. So I think Rachel will contact you and get those. That would be good to see some on the Fontaine-Pajot.
Yeah, we love photos. It's invaluable for other people that have the same type of boat.
Yeah, so look, folks, that was really good, and we really appreciate a very well put together presentation. You've absolutely nailed it in terms of timing. So we will let you go and have a great. What are you in the middle of summer there, aren't you? So it's probably still bright daylight. Yeah,
it's hot here. Yeah, we're hitting 30 degrees this weekend.
Beautiful. All right, so thank you very much, and then Rachel will put the recording up on the YouTube channel in the coming few days. Then if people want to type in and look for it, it will pop up on Google searches and so on. So it's a great resource to have.
That's wonderful. We really appreciate it.
All right, so thank you very much. And on that note, we will finish today's presentation.